Bankruptcy lawyers can tell you're going to file before you know it yourself, sometimes a full year before. It's not the missed payments, it's not the collection calls. Multiple bankruptcy attorneys describe the same early tell: how a person orders food. Clients who once split a dinner bill down to the penny start closing out $300 tabs without blinking, like the money's already gone anyway. That's anecdotal, but it lines up with something researchers have actually measured: a well-documented spike in short-term spending right before long-term financial control breaks down. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you're going to hear the behaviors attorneys track in the year before a filing, the federal data that confirms parts of that pattern and complicates others, and the one decision almost every client makes 12 months out that guarantees they'll end up in that office. But here's what doesn't add up. Some of the people heading straight for bankruptcy look on paper like they're doing everything right. So what are lawyers actually seeing that the numbers don't show? To understand what these attorneys are picking up on, you have to understand the scale of what's happening across the country right now, not just in one office. Bankruptcy filings in the United States climbed sharply in 2025, roughly 574,000 total filings, according to bankruptcy court data compiled by the American Bankruptcy Institute, an increase of about 11% over the year before. That's not a handful of unlucky people. That's hundreds of thousands of households moving through some version of the exact same slow-motion year we're about to walk through. And the people involved aren't who you'd expect. Attorneys interviewed for reporting on this topic described teachers, nurses, small business owners, and middle managers, people with steady paychecks and, from the outside, completely ordinary lives. This lines up with a shift researchers have flagged for years. Bankruptcy in America increasingly touches working, insured, employed households, not just people who've lost their jobs. The stakes for these clients are enormous, not just financially, but socially. Filing still carries a heavy stigma in the U.S., and for a lot of these clients, the fear of being seen as a failure outweighs the fear of the debt itself. That combination, real financial pressure plus real shame, is why the year before filing looks the way it does: quiet, hidden, full of small decisions that make sense to the person making them, but form a recognizable pattern to anyone trained to spot it. What follows is a mix of two different kinds of evidence: what attorneys say they personally observe across thousands of cases, and what economists and psychologists have separately measured in national data. Where those two things agree, the pattern is hard to dismiss. Where they don't, that's actually the more interesting part. The first stage attorneys describe happens roughly 12 months out, and it's the one almost nobody expects. Spending on non-essentials actually goes up before it collapses. This is attorney anecdote, not hard data specific to bankruptcy filers, but it echoes a broader, well-established finding in household finance research. People under mounting financial stress often increase discretionary spending briefly before pulling back sharply, a pattern behavioral economists sometimes link to short-term coping rather than long-term planning. It looks like confidence. It's more likely the opposite. And it's usually the first crack that months later a lawyer will point to and say, "That's when it started." From there, the pattern moves into something the data actually backs up directly: the credit card shuffle. Household credit card debt in the U.S. hit a record $1.277 trillion in the final quarter of 2025, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Household Debt and Credit Report, the highest balance recorded since the New York Fed began tracking this data in 1999. Attorneys describe this stage in personal terms. The credit card stops being a convenience and quietly becomes the difference between eating and not eating that week. New charges shift from restaurants and shopping trips to groceries, gas, and utility bills. And there's a specific mechanism that makes this stage so damaging. A widely cited study from researchers at NYU's Stern found that roughly 29% of credit card accounts regularly make payments at or near the required minimum, a default behavior that can keep a balance alive and growing for years, even when the person believes they're managing it. This is the stage where the client still thinks they're standing afloat. The math says they're financing the sinking. Somewhere around the 9 to 10-month mark, the behavior shifts again. And here, the anecdote and the research converge almost exactly. Attorneys describe clients who stop opening mail entirely. Envelopes stacked in drawers, sometimes taped shut. Phone calls from unknown numbers left unanswered for months. That's not a lawyer's dramatic flourish. It's a documented phenomenon economists call the ostrich effect, first identified in a widely cited 2009 study on financial avoidance and confirmed since in follow-up research, including a paper from the University of North Carolina's Keenan-Flagler Business School showing that people's attention to their own financial accounts actually decreases as their spending and overdrafts increases. In plain terms, the worse things get, the less people look. It's not laziness, it's a documented, predictable human response to dread. And documented or not, it's what turns a manageable problem into a legal one, because unopened mail doesn't stop compounding. Here's where the story takes a turn that changes almost everything you've heard so far. You'd assume the people furthest along this path are the ones with the least money coming in. That's not what attorneys report, and it's not fully what the broader data shows either. Plenty of filers have steady, even six-figure incomes. What separates them isn't earnings, it's how long they've been able to hide the problem from the people closest to them, including a spouse. This part is backed by survey research, not just courtroom anecdote. A national survey from Bankrate found that roughly 9% of Americans in committed relationships are currently keeping a major source of debt or spending secret from their partner. And a separate study from the National Endowment for Financial Education found that nearly 2 in 4 adults admit to some form of financial infidelity, hiding a purchase, a bill, or an account from a spouse altogether. Attorneys describe couples where one partner has known about the debt for the better part of a year and simply never said anything, quietly moving money or picking up freelance work just to keep the illusion of normal life intact. The bankruptcy, when it finally happens, isn't really the collapse. Survey data suggests the collapse, the secrecy, was often already sitting inside the relationship for months before anyone filed a single form. Once that secrecy starts to break down, usually between month 10 and month 12, attorneys report the behavior accelerating fast. People selling off smaller possessions on resale apps, and for the first time, turning to payday loans or cash advance apps to cover a single bill. This next part deserves an honest caveat because it's where the evidence gets genuinely murky. Some academic research, including a widely cited economics paper, has found real links between access to payday lending and rising local bankruptcy rates. But other legal and economic analyses have found no clear evidence that payday lending itself causes bankruptcy, rather than simply showing up alongside it. What's not in dispute, and what attorneys consistently flag in case files, is a narrower legal fact. Cash advances taken shortly before filing, typically within 90 days, can be challenged in court and may not even be dischargeable, meaning the very tool someone reaches for to avoid bankruptcy can end up following them directly into it. And then comes the detail attorneys bring up more than almost any other, because it's the one that finally breaks the silence. The first phone call to a law office almost never comes from the person in debt. It comes from a spouse, an adult child, or a sibling, someone who finally noticed enough small signs stacked together to say something out loud. By the time that call happens, the person at the center of it has usually known, on some level, for the better part of a year. And what happens in the weeks right after that call is almost nothing like what most people expect it to be. Here's the part that surprises almost everyone once they finally sit down in that office. The meeting itself is rarely the dramatic, humiliating moment people spent a year dreading. Attorneys describe the opposite. This part is anecdotal, drawn from repeated professional accounts rather than a formal study, but it's remarkably consistent across interviews. The dominant emotion in that first consultation is often relief, sometimes suddenly enough that people cry within the first few minutes, not because they're devastated, but because for the first time in nearly a year, someone else finally knows, and nothing has fallen apart. The mail gets opened. The unanswered calls stop being terrifying. The secret that took 12 months to build gets dismantled in about an hour. That's the real tension this story's been building toward, and here's how it resolves. The thing people spend a year desperately trying to avoid is, by attorneys' own accounts, almost always less painful than the year spent avoiding it. The spending, the secrecy, the payday loans, the silence, none of it, according to either the courtroom anecdotes or the broader research on avoidance and debt, actually made anything better. It delayed a conversation that, once it finally happened, turned out to be the easiest part of the entire process. And here's the detail worth sitting with on your way out. By the time a case file lands on an attorney's desk, the paperwork is essentially the last chapter of a story that was already written months earlier, in 100 small choices nobody else could see, and in at least a few habits researchers have now measured well enough to name: rising discretionary spending, minimum payment drift, the ostrich effect, hidden debt from a spouse. The filing doesn't create the story, it just puts it on the record. Which means the moment that actually matters most in this entire process isn't the day someone walks into a law office at all. It's the day months before when they decided not to open that envelope.